So this is part two of Lorca's Duende in Poet in New York and the significance on poetry then and now. Um, so when Lorca was living in New York, he was supposed to go to Columbia, and it was in the middle of Harlem. And it was at the height of the Harlem Renaissance, which had started actually after World War One. And in 1929, it was still going. And really, it was the cultural center of New York, Harlem was. And so instead of going to class at Columbia, Lorca went to the jazz clubs. Lorca hung out where he could to hear jazz and also listen to flamenco. He didn't speak any English. But in Spanish Harlem, he found people that he could speak Spanish with. So he didn't have to speak English. In the jazz clubs, he heard the cross-cultural influences and dialogue that exists between jazz and flamenco. And that's what just blew his mind away. I'm sure he had heard jazz before when he was in Spain, but not in Harlem. And that just blew his mind away. And it's there in the poems, and it influenced him. I will say, I have to acknowledge that there are some of his letters to his parents that are distasteful in the things that he wrote about jazz dancers and Black women. And some people have, find it, he just got a little too much into the body electric, I think. And at the same time, again, that historical empathy, his parents, his family never wanted they never wanted to talk about his queerness ever. Didn't even want his poems published when they were being published, even when his family was able to return to Spain. They just did not want to address his homosexuality. Yet it's definitely there. So it's interesting. I mean, there's so much about looking at the totality of a writer, and again, that historical empathy, and also what it means for the intersectionality of their sexuality. And I think I'm going off on a tangent right now, but I'm just going to say the poems are what we're going to focus on, in particular an excerpt from The Blacks, because there's a specific line in here that has been translated across time, and it's a really significant line. So blueness, and blue is the horizon. It is a symbol of water. It is the symbol of uncertainty. It is a symbol. And he's talking about crackling blue. What is that crackling blue? And so this is from The Blacks, his poem, The Blacks. It is through the crackling blue, blue without worm or a sleeping footprint, where the ostrich eggs remain eternal and the dancing rains wander untouched. It is through the blue without history, blue of a night without fear of day, blue where the blink of the wind goes splitting, the sleepwalking camels of the empty clouds. It's where the torsos dream under the gluttony of grass. There the corals soak the ink's despair, the sleepers erase their profiles under the skein of snails, and the space of the dance remains over the final ashes. So what does this crackling blueness mean? He's talking about the crackling blueness of water that separates Granada, el sur de España, Andalusia, from Africa. And he says, there's no trace. There's no trace. Why do you think people don't want to talk about these things? Well, in the United States, it was the Jim Crow laws of just a drop of black blood made you, well, and in Spain, that also, that colorism was there. And that colorism was also connected to caste and money, really more about money and caste. And then if you got more upper caste. It didn't matter if the colorism doesn't matter as much as just how much money you had. And there's the caste system, which was really, in Lorca's time, it was feudalism. I mean, just wrap your minds around that. In 1929, there was a latifundos, and it was feudalism. And that was one of the things he was speaking out against. And but the history of slavery in Andalusia and the history of blackness within the country and how Spaniards are treated across the globe that's part of it. But notice what he says: the space of the dance remains over the final ashes. And they're so unmistakable. He's talking about the rhythms, the transatlantic rhythms, the rhythms that exist between flamenco, the cantajondo, and jazz. This is what it meant during the Guerra Civil and the feudalism. This one quote is what I think we need to address, because right now there's a really dangerous divisiveness that's happening in Latinidad and Hispanic culture, where we need to talk about blackness. And then there was this huge debate it's a dangerous dialogue, and we need to be looking at this, and people are. And okay, during the Guerra Civil, Captain Gonzalo Aguirre, an estate owner and press officer for Franco, so press officer meaning he controlled the media, lined up his workers, randomly selected 6, and publicly shot them as a warning to others. Aguilera's actions are not surprising in light of what he told an AP correspondent about the Spanish masses. They are slave stock, he said. They are good for nothing but slaves, and only when they are used as slaves are they happy. Near Cordoba, at the beginning of the war, a landowner shot 10 of his workers in retribution for every fighting bull the workers had slaughtered for food during a brief collectivization of his estate. Outside Sevilla, fascist officers made peasants dig their own graves before shooting them. Just before the peasants were murdered, the officers mocked them. Didn't you ask for a plot of land? The officers yelled. Now you're going to have one, and forever. So Andalusia, the south, that's where you really see the mixture of races, the global Andalusia. That region of Spain was taken over first by the fascists, partly because Franco had been a general in Morocco, and he was actually using Moroccan soldiers, so it got really complicated. But the racism in there and the divisiveness and the way that the caste system played out, along with racism and the legacy of slavery in Andalusia, and also how that connects to even in my my family's immigration story. These are things that we're finally talking about now. And then for people within my immigrant group, it's very hard to talk about because the history's been erased. And also, where's the willingness? I have a father who was an affirmative action officer, and he grew up in Monterey on Cannery Row in a community that was regarded during its time as the center point for resistance against Japanese internment. And in the height of Fort Ord, which was the largest military base on the West Coast, it was Seaside, California, was regarded as one of the West Coast points, one of the biggest centers for civil rights on the West Coast. So, but not everybody, even from my own immigrant group, will talk about this, and not even within my own family. But I think it's interesting to have that awareness and then come to this history and look at what does it mean in the totality of how Lorca's Duende has influenced Black poets during his time and then afterwards. He was heavily influenced, or actually, Langston Hughes was heavily influenced by Federico Garcia Lorca. Langston Hughes was the poet of Harlem, but he was not living in Harlem in 1929. So they missed each other. Langston Hughes actually did speak fluent Spanish because his father lived in Mexico and actually pretended to be Mexican Spanish because he was able to pass, because he didn't want to deal with the Jim Crow laws. And it was easier in Mexico to pass as someone who was Mexican Spanish and than it would be to live in the United States as a Black man. He was an attorney, didn't want to deal with it. It's interesting to look at the parallels between Langston Hughes and Lorca. Langston Hughes' father supported him, but did not support him being a poet and did not support his being a Black poet. And he did not understand why. They had bitter arguments about it. And Langston Hughes went to Columbia in 1919 and dropped out. And his father said he wouldn't support him if he just wanted to be a poet. And Langston Hughes said, okay. And his father had expected him to be an attorney, much like Lorca's father expected him to be an attorney. And Langston Hughes didn't. He dropped out of Columbia and forged his own way. They never met, but Langston Hughes read Romancero Gitano when he was a correspondent in Madrid during the height of the Guerra Civil in 1937. So Langston Hughes was part of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. He was there as a war correspondent. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade was an American brigade of volunteer soldiers who went to fight in Spain. There were many Black officers in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade because Franco was using soldiers from Morocco, and it was very complicated because of, again, his own racism and how they were using Black bodies to fight a nationalist cause that was at its roots very classist and racist. As I said, the South was taken over by the fascists first. Madrid was one of the last cities to be taken over, and that was the capital. In 1937, Madrid was bombed almost nightly by the nationalists. Hughes was amazing. He was a human being, and he suffered from horrible stomach problems due to anxiety. His father gave him literally an ulcer when he was a child visiting his dad, and his stomach acted up when he was in Madrid. And he writes about this in one of his memoirs. He said that he read Lorca's Romancero Gitano as a way to keep his spirits going with the Spanish people who sang each night as a way to keep their spirits going during the bombing. And I wish he had more about what Romancero Gitano meant to him, especially about the double voicedness, because Langston Hughes wrote about the blues and the blues vernacular very similarly the way that Lorca wrote about the cante and flamenco. There were so many cross-cultural parallels, but Langston Hughes didn't, that haven't found anything yet where he talks about it, but I think it's an interesting cross-cultural parallel in the language. That said, Langston Hughes began translating Romancero Gitano in 1951. He was not the first poet to translate Romancero into English. However, in order to make those translations, he still had to get permission from Lorca's brother, Francisco Lorca, who was a professor at Columbia and under a gag order, as all academics were, to not talk about the Guerra Civil. So he was an expatriate. The family had to go to Cuba first to get out of Spain, and they were able to get asylum by 1951. But as an academic, he had a special academic visa, and he and any other academic from Spain that were able to escape you would lose your visa. You did not talk about your family. So imagine Francisco Lorca, who is Federico Garcia Lorca's brother, could not talk about his brother, but he still allowed the translation of Romancero Gitano. And the poems themselves, there's the Duende, there's the pushback. And I think that when you make the Duende political, it maybe loses its potency. So I think I'm answering my own question. Did Lorca ever talk, or did Langston Hughes ever talk about the cross-cultural parallels he saw to Romancero Gitano? No. But it's conspicuous when he published it and his translations of it and some of the language that he used. And there's the Duende and how you hit the present with the past. Romancero Gitano was about the past of the Inquisition. Lorca wrote those in the 20s and 30s. Hughes translated Romancero Gitano in 1951. The year is conspicuous. So they were in a time where it was like, don't talk about the past. That's the recent past. But they still hit the present with the past from an old past, the past of the Inquisition that no one, you can talk about the Inquisition, right? But you use it as a metaphor to talk about something deeper in the endurance of the human spirit. And you see this in Ballad of the Sleepwalker, in particular, Hughes's translation of the first line. It uses the future conditional. Green, as I would have you green. And green symbolizes death, not life. Death. Hughes's use of the future conditional is conspicuous to other translations of Lorca's poetry, as it offers greater insight into the narrative and larger meaning of the poem. The rim of the wound, the exploration of the duende of the Spanish people through the metaphor of the gitano, and the fragmented images and multi-voice narrative of a very plausible nightmare. Well, all of us are going to encounter death. There is no escaping it. But green as I would have you green, the poem goes on about being, it's the Inquisition, and the lover is escaping and trying to get back to his beloved, and he can't. But it's the plausible nightmare. How are you going to face your death? What are you going to do with your life in the meantime? What are you going to stand for? Hughes translated Romancero Gitano in 1951. I believe that's also the same year that he talked to Francisco Lorca about translating it. In 1953, shortly after those poems were published, Langston Hughes was called before Senate Joseph McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee and was questioned because of the kinds of solidarity he wrote about having for workers in poems like 1937's Song of Spain, as well as saying in 1949, when McCarthyism began, if the 12 communists are sent to jail, in a little while they will send Negroes to jail simply for being Negroes and to concentration camps for being colored. And actually, what he says is very real. It did happen. We're seeing it with the new Jim Crow and the way that the drug war targets Black and brown people, and the way that political movements have been taken down with the drug war. What's conspicuous in here is that any kind of racial solidarity or racial awareness in the 50s, especially during that era, was seen as, oh, you're a communist. It was also included in the 30s. Meanwhile, there's this. The Blackness of Spanish people is there. And this is the legacy here in this country. We serve whites only. We serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans. And Lorca was very aware of this. And so was Langston Hughes. And this history is something that we need to remember, because there's a very dangerous divisiveness that's always occurred between Spaniards and Latin America. And it's like somehow, oh, well, you're European and, the conquistador. And it's like, no, who's the power structure? How do we stand together? And it doesn't matter even the color of our skin. It's what we stand for and who we stand with and why. And that divisiveness is something that I don't think has helped anyone ultimately in the end. And it's just supporting white supremacy across the globe. But how do we push back again? How does art push back against it? Because the great art unifies us. The great art, great poetry, the Duende brings us together. Langston Hughes was one of the first Black poets to translate Lorca, but another poet who wrote directly about him is the poet Bob Kaufman. And I'm going to share with you an article that came out in 2009 in the Bay Guardian about who Bob Kaufman was and how he reflects what I called California Duende Blues. Sometimes it's easy to get into the cult of personality around these poets. Lorca, the mythology of who he was as a person, we got to be careful. We can't ignore his poems and his plays. And the same with Bob Kaufman. However, the mythology of Bob Kaufman rivals what we have left of his poetry, because his poetry was all performed mainly on street corners, and sometimes he just did not write them down. However, to place him within a mere cult of personality undermines the innovation of his process and what it brings to the tapestry of American poetics and the complicated and surreal orality of his poems. Called the American Rimbaud by the French, Kaufman lived as a poetic assassin, a frequently arrested union organizer like Stagger Lee, wielding a 44 of devil's poetry. Kaufman assaulted the willing and unwilling, even white police officers, with verse. If you were cool, you knew his assault was meant as a cipher, a juxtaposition of rhythm, image, and sound meant to invite the listener into a dialectical examination of identity, even the identity obtained from syntax. I went to a masquerade disguised as myself, not one of my friends recognized. Kaufman's poetics were Kerouac's spontaneous prose without the notebook taken literally. Think an unchoreographed version of Amethyst Rocks, the prison yard scene in the movie Slam, where Saul Williams stops a would-be beatdown with poetry. Except for Kaufman, the beatdown was always real, inevitable, and though sometimes provoked, never for the camera. Kaufman was the true spirit of North Beach, Bohemia, the street poet who stood on yardward corners of embryonic hopes, drowned in a heroin tear, panhandling with moist prophet eyes, freestyles of surrealism, the blues, and Duende, meant to disturb, disrupt, and ultimately liberate. Kaufman's crackling blueness is distinctly Californian. In poems like Carl Chessman Interviews the PTA, Kaufman filters the West of the West through the absurdist reflections that juxtapose outlaw figures such as Chessman, a 1960 serial killer on San Quentin's death row, with figures from California's mythology, all to the rhythms of a radio announcer calling a ball game. Carl Chessman is in sickly California writing death threats to the Wizard of Oz. His trial is being held in the stomach of Junipero Serra. At last, the game starts. Chessman steals all the bases and returns to his tomb to receive the last sacraments from Shirley Temple. According to poet and scholar Nathaniel Mackey, what Kaufman creates is a cross-cultural poetics difficult to categorize. Though he lived in North Beach and is credited with coining the phrase beatnik and infused his poetry with jazz and Eastern religious influence, Kaufman transcends the singular categorization of beat poet. By aligning himself with the pain of all losers, brown, red, black, and white, the colors from the master palette, Kaufman creates a new American poetics, a hybrid poetics of projective California Duende blues, an examination of the exhaustion that comes from the persistence of breath. Whew. And this is Kaufman. In my article here, I talk about how he got beatdowns from police for being a union organizer, and also, doing poetry, gone up to people. If you should see a man walking down the street talking to himself, do not fear, for that man is a poet. You have nothing to fear from the poet except the truth. See the scars on his face. I don't know if you can see. Yeah, see the scars on his face? That's from the beatdowns that he got. And he was a poet who I feel like reading his poetry helped me better understand Lorca. And this is one of his poems that helps me see Lorca and help me understand these cross-cultural themes, as well as my dad's huasa and a lot of my father's beliefs and things that my father has said. And yeah, okay. The night that Lorca comes. The night that Lorca comes shall be a strange night in the South. It shall be the time when Negroes leave the South forever. Green trains shall arrive from red planet Mars. Crackling blueness shall send tooth-covered cars for them to leave in, to go into the North forever. And I see my little girl mother again with her cross that is not burning, her skirts of black of all colors, her aura of familiarity. The South shall weep bitter tears to no avail. The Negroes have gone into crackling blueness. Crispus attacks shall arrive with the Boston Commons to take Landy north. Crispus Attucks shall be laying on Boston Commons. Landy shall feel alive again. I shall call her name as she steps on to the Boston Commons and flies north forever. Lincoln shall be there to see them leave the South forever. Landy, she will be green. The white South shall gather at the Preservation Hall. And what he's building in that poem, and you see it with the crackling blueness, and he says it in another poem about Lorca. Black man, go to the sun of your center. Go to Lorca and the crackling blueness, Lorca who lived in the Spain of the Inquisition, those who translated him and did not understand that he came from the Spain of the Inquisition. That goes back to the blacks, the blue, the crackling blue, the blue without worm or sleeping footprint, the blue without history, and the space of the dance that remains over the final ashes. Poets that I know in Spain, they don't know who Bob Kaufman is. I translated this poem for them into Spanish. They know some of, they know Allen Ginsberg, of course, but Kaufman, no. They didn't even know who Francisco Alarcón was. It depends on who you have as a professor in the universities. And the universities, it's transgressive, it's complicated. And it's also very much an erased history that we need to look at. San Francisco's current poet laureate, Tongo Eisen Martin, he comes from this tradition of Bob Kaufman, of Lorca, and it's very exciting. But this is where we are now in Spain, and talking about this erased history finally, but talking what it means for those who were killed during the Guerra Civil, means for my immigrant group. This is what I'm writing about. This is what I'm looking at. And this is part of the academic community, because you had to understand, unless you don't get the money to come to the United States, if you're not connected to an academic institution, if you don't know how to write grants to get the money to come to the United States, forget it. If you don't know how to get those grants, you're not coming here. And also, even here in the United States, how do you get to Spain? How do you have this dialogue? Lorca hustled his dad to write Poet in New York. He didn't, and he had dropped out of college, but times were a little different then. Now it's like, how do you do this? How do you get out there? How do you have that dialogue? How do you get it going? And how do you find the money? And it's hard. And in the universities are a way for artists. Roro is university educated. He had to work very, very hard. And he's still outside of universities now because it's too transgressive. And then they'll say, where's the data? Where's the evidence? Especially for historians. My cousin was a history major at the University of Seville, and he's trying to talk about things within his own family. And, he was really called to the carpet about having enough evidence, and the evidence, when it's been erased, it's very difficult. So I'm just going to show you this. And these are people that are part of the Transatlantic Rhythms Dialogue, that conference that I went to in University of Veracruz. And I'm just going to stop it here and have you guys listen.
Disseram dia assim, tu és diferente. E a partir de hoje tu tens que sofrer.
Popularmente, todo el mundo pensaba que en España no hubo esclavos. Yo, solamente para la tesis sobre la Granada del siglo XVI, encontré 2.500 documentos de compraventa de esclavos.
Cuando empecé a componer, iba buscando ese misterio de eso que dicen que hay unos sonidos negros dentro de la música andaluza. Siendo Sevilla la dueña del universo explorado.
Por Sevilla entran del orden de 90.000 africanos esclavos. Un 10% reembarca para América. Pero ¿y los 80.000 restantes?
Los únicos países europeos donde hubo una población negra importante fueron España y Portugal. De lo que tenemos noticias de la importancia que tienen en los bailes, en la construcción de la fiesta callejera.
Hay algo de lo negro que claramente ha quedado en la cultura andaluza, ¿no? Y en gran medida esas cosas no son materiales, sino son expresivas.
El pueblo también tenía esclavos. Tenían esclavos los mercaderes, tenían esclavos los sacerdotes, todo el mundo tenía esclavos.
En el Caribe afroandaluz se experimentaron muchas cosas y allí en Veracruz hay mucha relación con lo que llaman el fandango indiano.
Lo negro, sin embargo, se ha extirpado del arte flamenco. El negro es el otro. El negro es el esclavo.
Se produjo una negación sistemática de cualquier vinculación de España con el mundo negro.
En una ciudad como Sevilla apenas existe una memoria de lo que ha sido la presencia africana, la presencia negra en esta ciudad.
A tratarme como me has tratado, antes de quererme hubiera dejado. A tratarme como me has tratado, antes de quererme hubiera dejado. A tratarme como me has tratado, antes de quererme hubiera dejado.
All of these things, queerness, class solidarity, and Blackness, Lorca wrote about in Poet in New York. And those subjects are still needing to be discussed today, because we're still needing to understand how the Duende, again, translates across spirits, across all of this. It's not just the brutality of the Guerra Civil. The Guerra Civil was directly connected to the brutality of the Inquisition, the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade, the brutality of imperialism, and that what we would call white supremacy. And to get back to ourselves, to get back to healing, I think, comes back to the Duende and art and storytelling and literature and music. And I'm not a politician, and I'm not an economist, and I'm not a biologist, but I think all of those people who are in those disciplines would agree that we need the arts to keep a dialogue going and help us. And that's where we're going to be looking at the work of Pedro Almodovar next week, as continuing the Duende, and then looking at, of course, the great pieces of literature that you guys are reading. Okay, this went on a little bit longer than I expected today. I'd like to give you the rest of the class period to discuss, just to reflect what you got, what surprised you, what stood out to you. You have the PowerPoint, so you can go back into some of the poems if there's any lines in there. What are you thinking? I'm still that little girl on the It's a Small World ride, kind of like, yay, it's a small world, looking for the connections between all cultures as a way to unify us. Thank you.